our guest, Professor Babones. Uh, so I welcome you all. And before going on to any discussions, though, uh, SETU and I, on behalf of SETU, would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, sea, and waters, and of the area that we live and work across Australia. We acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Uh, so, welcome everyone. With that acknowledgement, I can begin introducing Professor Milind Sathe, a good friend and uh, an academician of decades. So he's a banking and finance specialist with a career spanning about 4 decades. Started in Reserve Bank of India and then before moving to Australia. In Australia, he's into academia and contributes his opinions in major media outlets. And his expertise in banking has been sought by both state and federal level agencies on numerous occasions. Apart from banking and finance, Professor Sathe uses his academic skills in various Hindu and Indian cultural areas. He's one of the prominent Australian Hindus who actively critiques media misinformation about Hindu culture, history, and other aspects based on rational and scientific principles. He teaches Hindu philosophy and its scientific aspects through classroom sessions, writing, and videos, as he has done recently with the Infinity Foundation. I would encourage everyone to go on the YouTube, and if you just search Milind Sathe and Infinity Foundation, you'll find that very intriguing video. Um, before more than going before moving forward and passing on to Professor Sathe for the attendance, just a couple of housekeeping activities. Please keep on mute so that there is no background noise which comes through. And if you have not put your names on the attendance box, please put your full name. Um, Thank you for that. And with that, I'll pass on to Professor Sathe. Professor Sathe, the floor is yours.
Would you mind briefing about SETU a bit, activities?
Yeah, sorry. Uh, just introducing SETU. So SETU stands for Eternal Thinking for Unity, and it's a startup, or it's a non-profit cohort of academicians, business people, and intellectuals who are Australian Indians. Our aim is to bridge the contacts and cooperation between the people from both the democracies about sharing knowledge, ideas, IPs, and other projects in different areas, different projects, different sectors to benefit both countries and world at large. SETU focuses mainly on Shiksha, which is education, and Vyapar, which is business or trade. To know more about SETU, you can visit our social media and our website, which is setuaustralia.org.au. Thank you about that. And with that, I'll pass on to Professor Sathe.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kape, for that. Namaste all. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Salvatore Babones, a sociologist at the University of Sydney. His research focus is on the political sociology of democracy. Author and editor of 14 books and many academic research articles, Salvatore has contributed to public policy issues and has been a widely cited commentator. The Wall Street Journal named his book on President Trump as the best on politics. He has a keen interest in the politics in India. His interviews on Indian TV channels have gone viral. People generally expect academics to provide a balanced voice on public policy issues. Unfortunately, some academics align themselves with political parties and take an anti-Modi, anti-BJP stance. They not only brush aside the positive achievements of the Modi government, but even invent Modi's failures. In the den of such voices, a few academics dare to challenge the false narrative. Salvatore is prominent amongst them. He doesn't take sides, but provides an objective assessment, and yet Salvatore has ruffled the feathers of the anti-Modi camp. Interestingly, when nearly 1 billion people are participating in India's national elections, a systematic narrative is being pushed by foreign media and international organizations that democracy in India is under threat. They gleefully ignore that India is probably the only country in the world where elections are regularly held right at the level of the village council. Professor Lindbergh, director of VDEM, recently noted that India no longer qualifies as an electoral democracy. Freedom House and Cato Institute reports are in a similar vein. These are lapped up without question by foreign media and by some academics. Exasperated by the adverse publicity, the Modi government announced that it would develop its own democracy index, an insider's perspective. Against the above background, the Indian diaspora, who possess first-hand lived experience of Indian democracy, is agitated. They suspect a conspiracy by vested interest against India. From their perspective, there is rather too much of freedom in India. They ask several questions. VDM is funded, among others, by the World Bank and the European Commission. What is the motivation for the funding and producing such reports that people in India would consider outlandish? VDM seems to echo the perspective of the opposition parties in India. Isn't it biased then? Are the parameters used by VDM and others valid? How do they collect data and analyze it? Are the outcomes independently weighted? If not, why do organizations like the World Bank and others continue to support them? Do actions of some state governments, like West Bengal or Kerala, against journalists contaminate the overall results? These and many other questions haunt the diaspora. Diaspora is also surprised why academic interest is lacking in countering such a narrative. Alternatively, why aren't there more Salvatores? We look forward to what Salvatore has to say on these and related issues. I hand over to Salvatore. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I am going to bring in some brand new information from the book I'm writing on Indian democracy into today's session. And I'm looking forward to hearing people's thoughts about that. Let me start by just saying that it's often said that India is the world's largest democracy. Everybody knows this. School children are taught this. What's more interesting is that India is by far the world's poorest democracy. Now, often people are insulted. I call India a poor country. Facts are facts, and India's GDP per capita is roughly on a par with the continent of Africa. And like the continent of Africa, there are some places in India that are relatively higher productivity. So Kerala has a GDP per capita that is similar to that of the Union of South Africa. And other places that are poorer. Bihar has a GDP per capita that's similar to that in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is, relatively speaking, a similar level income area and similar in population, for that matter, to the continent of Africa. Yet India is far more democratic than the continent of Africa as a whole, and I would say far more democratic than, I believe, any particular country in Africa, although opinions on that differ. India is also the world's only post-colonial country to have remained a democracy throughout its entire history. Now, I have to qualify that a little bit. There are some small island countries, some British colonies that became democracies very late. So, for example, Belize is a small Caribbean nation that was a British colony until the 1970s, and it had a peaceful transition into a local democracy. But among major post-colonial states that fought for their independence early on, India is the only one that not only was born as a democracy, but remained a democracy. India is also, to my mind, the only meaningful democracy that's well institutionalized, that has a history of routine elections on the Eurasian continent between South Korea on one side and Israel on the other. In that whole zone, there's only one well institutionalized democracy. Yes, there are other countries that may right now have elections, but they have troubled histories of having periods of democracy and periods of dictatorship and going back and forth. It's for these reasons that I say that from a statistical perspective, India is the world's most extraordinarily successful democracy, or you might even simply say India is the world's most extraordinary democracy because it is extraordinary. It's not an ordinary democracy. Ordinary democracies are places in North America, Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific Rim, the rich countries of the Pacific Rim like Taiwan and Japan, or the rich countries of Western and Central Europe. These are typical democracies. India does not fit the social, demographic, and historical profile of any of these other well-established democracies. And that makes India truly different. Now, social science, until very recently, acknowledged this. That is, until 2017, India was generally viewed as being one of the best-rated democracies in the world. In fact, the main democracy rating project, academic democracy rating project, up until 2017, was what's known as the Polity data set. Sometimes you'll hear Polity 4. They're now on version 5, so it's now the Polity 5 data set if you want to go looking for it. It began in the early 1970s with the political scientist Ted Gurr, who developed it in the United States, and it now continues as an independent foundation, providing data for studies of comparative studies of democracy. The Polity democracy data, in fact, are the most widely used in academia. Not anymore. Most current studies focus on changing over from using the Polity data to using the Varieties of Democracy Institute data, which we'll discuss in some detail. But it's worth noting that until 2017, if you wanted to know whether or not a country was a democracy, you went to Polity. Now, the Polity data set has a 21-point scale for measuring democracy, going from -10, a full autocracy, up to +10, a full democracy. And on that scale, India, for the last couple decades, has been rated +9. In fact, that's slightly higher than the United States at +8. Now, these minor differences, +8, +9, +10, don't really matter much on the Polity scale. The Polity scale is meant to be a broad measure of democracy, not a highly detailed measure. So, for example, that difference between the United States at +8, India at +9, and Australia, which is +10, the entire difference among these three countries has to do with a single item in the Polity rating system, which has to do with how partisan parties are. And in the conceptualization of the political scientists who develop the Polity scale, if a political party puts narrow partisan interests ahead of national interests, that is not good for democracy. And on that ranking, the United States, which is a highly partisan country, only comes in at +8. India, which is highly partisan, but let's face it, not as partisan as America, comes in at +9. Australia, where the parties don't really differ that much and both parties pursue similar goals, comes in at +10. Okay, so if the Polity data, if the new democracy data set that we now know, the Varieties of Democracy Institute database, had not been created in 2017, we would all be looking at the Polity database for information about Indian democracy. We would all think Indian democracy is of extremely high quality. In fact, it's of better quality than even American democracy. Okay. The problem is that political scientists don't all agree with the Polity appraisal. In the 2010s, a new democracy evaluation initiative took shape. I've alluded to it previously, the Varieties of Democracy Institute, or VDEM index. VDEM is based at Sweden's University of Gothenburg or Gothenburg. It's funded by the European Commission directly, that is the executive arm of the European Union, with funding also from the European Research Council, the Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian national research agencies, several major European foundations, and a few other minor sources. People often say that, oh, it's funded by George Soros because sure, the Open Society Foundation has given VDEM grants. That is a very minor component of VDEM's funding. And I believe that the Open Society Foundation money was only there to fund a conference, if I remember. Don't quote me on that. The main point is that VDEM represents Team Scandinavia or Team European Union as far as thinking about what democracy should be. VDEM was far better funded than the old Polity database. The Polity database is essentially something done in their spare time by a group of American academics. VDEM is a full-time endeavor with a large staff, with literally hundreds of people contributing to their database. It is exceptionally well funded, and it also has a public-facing component. So if you want polity data on democracy, it's really there for professional users. You have to go to a professional database, download it, work through the Excel files or the SPSS files yourself to figure things out. VDEM publishes a glossy report every year, starting with its 2017 report, which already in 2017 telegraphed democracy in danger. In fact, the 2017 report opened with the rhetorical question, quote, is there evidence of a global democratic backslide? And the answer, of course, was yes. That is, VDEM seemingly had a goal to alarm people with how dangerous the world was for democracy, which, of course, is why we all need to fund democracy research of the kind done by VDEM. Okay. In that inaugural VDEM report, India was rated number 73 out of 174 countries on its flagship measure of electoral democracy. So not quite in the top third of countries, upper part of the second third of countries. So second, top of the second team in the world, but not a real democracy like the top 60 or so, top third of the world countries. India was rated well below Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand. Now, that's the first time any of us would have learned that India was no longer a democracy. Because like I said, until 2017 in that report, India was considered a democratic success story. The Polity database, as I said, rated India in the very top tier and 1 point away from being a perfect democracy. So suddenly, India's democracy was in danger, and things only got worse from there. 4 years later, in 2021, VDEM downgraded India to a, quote, electoral autocracy, where democracy had, quote, broken down. That is, by 2021, VDEM felt India was no longer a democracy at all. Democracy had broken down. In 2024, the most recent report that came out in March, VDEM went even further, calling India a, quote, increasingly oppressive electoral autocracy. And for the first time, VDEM rated Indian democracy. Now, this is the 2024 report for 2023 democracy. Rated Indian democracy worse than in 1976. That is worse than in the depths of the emergency. So according to VDEM, Indian democracy today is in worse shape than in a period when 30 members of parliament had been imprisoned, several thousand other political prisoners were being held, constitutional protections for freedom and liberty were suspended, the Indian Express was running a blank front page because it wasn't allowed to report the news, and of course elections were suspended. I mean, literally, the 1976 elections were suspended. But today things are worse in the view of VDEM, which not only rates democracy today, but it goes back and rates on the same scale using the same items, democracy historically. Now let's put that in contrast. I mean, Polity still says that India is a high-quality democracy. The Economist Intelligence Unit, while it has downgraded Indian democracy in recent years, the Economist Intelligence Unit rates India on a par with Eastern European Union countries. So India falls right in the middle, not of Western Europe, but of countries that have been made eligible for European Union membership, which is to say, in the view of the Economist Intelligence Unit, India would be eligible for European Union membership based on its level of democracy. Not, problems, perhaps, but not anything alarming. Yet, we have this for 5 years running now, the world's most authoritative democracy rating organization calling India not a democracy. Now, according to the historical data compiled by VDEM, the best year, the high point of Indian democracy, and this may surprise some of you, was 1998. In other words, a time where India was going through repeated elections. I think there were 4 elections in 5 years in the late 1990s. Unstable governments had difficulty pulling together a majority and being able to run the country. At that point, according to VDEM's retrospective data, VDEM didn't exist in 1998, but its data have been made retrospective using an expert panel. It was ranked number 45 in the world. So again, among not at the level of Western Europe and the US, but in the same league as Western Europe in the US. That ranking slowly declined under a succession of BJP and Congress-led governments until Narendra Modi came to power. In 2014, the point where Narendra Modi was elected, the VDEM had already downgraded India from 45 to 71. And this is one reason among many why I emphasize, whenever I talk to people in India who have a political point of view, they may be Congress, they may be, op party, and they say, Salvatore, how can you say these things? It's Narendra Modi who's at fault. I say, well, you know what? Before Narendra Modi, VDEM had already shown a serious downgrading of Indian democracy. Of course, it has now been downgraded far more. From number 71 in the world in 2014, India has now been downgraded to 110th in the world. 110th, that is 110th out of 179 countries. So in the bottom half of the world in terms of democracy, not the bottom half of democracies, bottom half of the world. In fact, India is right now rated one step above Iraq for level of democracy. Now, I'd like to put that in comparative perspective. I've already mentioned the historical comparison that India now is rated worse than in 1976. But let me give you a geographical comparison. India is ranked 110. South Africa is ranked 53rd. South Africa is a one-party state where the ANC not only has won every single post-apartheid election, but it even governs all but one state in South Africa, which is to say it wins all the national elections and it wins the state elections. There's some questions of what will happen in this year's election, but this year notwithstanding, as of 2023, when VDEM was counting things, a highly corrupt, everybody acknowledges that the ANC is highly, highly corrupt, one-party state was ranked 53rd, whereas India is 110. The Solomon Islands are ranked 67th. In the Solomon Islands, it is widely acknowledged that there is a culture of vote buying to such an extent that it's considered the way democracy works in Solomon Islands is by local big men. They're not always. I think they're not almost always men. I believe they're always men. Buy their neighbors' votes and vie for their neighbors' votes by one-upping each other with literal cash payments. On top of that, the elections have turned so violent that Australian troops have had to be called in, and Solomon Islands elections are held under the supervision of Australian troops to ensure that the violence does not get out of hand. They're ranked 67th in the world. Sri Lanka, with which most Indians or people of Indian background are very familiar, is ranked 75th in the world. That's not great, but for a country which is in the midst of a constitutional crisis, to be ranked 675th, while India, again, is number 110. But let me give you an even better comparative example. Many of you may be familiar with the Maldives. The Maldives, of course, is a small island country just off the coast of India. It's ranked number 70 in the world by VDEM. Now, that's not a little bit above India. That's 40 places above India. Now, Maldives is ranked 70th in the world, despite, first, a constitution that denies citizenship to all non-Muslims. So any questions about the CAA in India, any questions about the National Register of Citizens, about potential anti-Muslim slant in India, should be taken in context of, in the Maldives, you must be Muslim or you can't be a citizen. Under the country's Sharia law, apostasy is punishable by death, which means if you are a Muslim and you convert to some other religion, you can, in theory, according to the law, be put to death with capital punishment. In the 2019 parliamentary elections in Maldives, a single party won 65 out of the 87 seats. So essentially it became a one-party state, but it won 65 of the 87 seats with just 46% of the vote. So again, the criticism of India that a party like the BJP can win 40% of the vote, yet a majority in the Lok Sabha, and how anti-democratic that is. Well, in the Maldives, there's an overwhelming supermajority, 65 out of 87, with a similar level of vote to what the BJP gets in India. In the 2023 presidential election, the leading candidate was disqualified because he was in prison. Again, if we want to criticize India for the treatment of Arvind Kejriwal, if we look to the Maldives, we see a president who was imprisoned in a corruption trial, and he's the leading opposition candidate, and he was replaced by a proxy candidate on the ballot who lost the election. According to the European Union's monitoring mission, in the 2023 presidential election, campaign finance laws were, quote, not enforced. State media, quote, blurred the boundaries between government functions and campaign activities, and the incumbent president, quote, received preferential treatment from state media. Okay, this should come as no surprise. In fact, Maldives law requires that all publications be approved by a state censorship board. Now, I bring this up not as some kind of whataboutery, well, you're going to criticize India, what about Maldives? But I bring it up because the reason the VDEM rankings are considered the authoritative ranking, the reason we academics have come to use the VDEM as our primary or even sole source of knowledge about democracy is that VDEM has the most sophisticated statistical data collection and data analysis infrastructure in the world for the study of democracy. And VDEM scores are statistically calibrated to be, the word they use is consistent, not just comparable, consistent across both space and time. What this means is, in their own methodological framework, if they rate India worse than in 1976, that's not some aberration. That's not because of different feelings at the time. That's because India is worse now than it was in 1976. If they rate India being far worse than Maldives, again, it's not because some person somewhere had a different opinion about Maldives or was bought off. No, it's because in their methodology, Maldives performs substantially better than in India. We're supposed to take these comparisons seriously. Now, the founder of the Varieties of Democracy Institute, the political scientist Staffan Lindberg, has publicly defended VDEM's current India ranking on multiple occasions. So it's not like they're not aware that the system may not be working for India. They're very aware of it, and he has publicly defended the ranking, saying that the VDEM is accurately pegging India's current democracy. And I'll just read to you from the 2024 report what it says about Indian democracy. It says that India's autocratization process has been well documented, including gradual but substantial deterioration of freedom of expression, compromising independence of the media, crackdowns on social media, harassments of journalists critical of the government, as well as attacks on civil society and intimidation of the opposition. The ruling anti-pluralist, Hindu nationalist, Bharatiya Janata Party, with Prime Minister Modi at the helm, has used laws on sedition, defamation, and counterterrorism to silence critics. The PJ government undermined the Constitution's commitment to secularism and continues to suppress the freedom of religious rights. Intimidation of political opponents and people protesting government policies, as well as silencing of dissent in academia, are now prevalent. Not these now happen, they now prevail. That is now the norm in India. Or as one article called it, there has been a silent emergency in India, or emergency by stealth. Now, it's not just VDEM that has taken such a negative view of Indian democracy in the last 5 to 10 years. Freedom House, the quasi-official American think tank, considers India to be only, quote, partly free. The World Justice Project, which is an offshoot of the American Bar Association, ranks India 79th out of 142 countries, so in the bottom half of the world for rule of law. Reporters Sans Frontières, the journalism organization, ranks India 161 out of 180 countries for press freedom, worse than Hong Kong. According to RSF, India is, quote, one of the world's most dangerous countries for the media, and the year 2022, quote, signaled the end, not signaled a threat. 2022, quote, signaled the end of pluralism in the mainstream media. And someone should tell my good friend and guru, Rajdeep Sardesai, that he's no longer on the air, because there is no pluralism, the end of pluralism in the mainstream media. Okay, things are allegedly even worse for religious freedom. The Washington-based Pew Research Center ranks India the second worst country in the world, number 2 after only Nigeria, for social hostilities involving religion. I can go on. I'll just give one more example. The highly respected United States Holocaust Memorial Museum ranks India the 5th most likely country in the world to experience, quote, mass killings, their euphemism for genocide. As recently as I believe it was 2019, India was rated 2nd in the world for genocide risk. Pakistan was rated 1st. But right now, it's India's ranked 5th in the world for genocide risk. Okay. Now, how is that possible? I mean, where does all this data come from? Well, the Holocaust Memorial Museum is a good example. Most of the predictor variables that go into their genocide index are taken from the VDEM database. That's also true of many other ranking systems that have proliferated in the last 5 to 10 years. So, for example, there's a Human Freedom Index compiled by America's Cato Institute and Canada's Fraser Institute. These are conservative think tanks. They rate India 109 out of 165 countries for human freedom. But again, most of their indicators come from the VDEM project. The Academic Freedom Index, which ranks India 130th out of 179 countries for academic freedom. And I'd like to put in the comical aside, just below the Hamas-administered Gaza Strip. Literally, the Academic Freedom Index says that academic freedom in India is worse than in Gaza. This is based entirely on VDEM data. The University of Würzburg in Germany produces a democracy matrix. It ranks India 85th out of 176 countries. Nearly all their data come from VDEM. So there now exists a widespread consensus, and this is reflected in dozens of articles in newspapers, magazines, books, that Indian democracy has failed catastrophically since Narendra Modi came to office in 2014. And who am I to say that consensus appraisal may or may not be correct? Nobody but God knows the true status of Indian democracy. But ultimately, if you trace back the threads, our consensus, when I say our, I mean the academic consensus that Indian democracy has been destroyed, ultimately derives from a single data source, the VDEM database. This poses a strange epistemological quandary. Let's say that in 2014, VDEM did not receive that European Commission grant, that it had never published its glossy first report in 2017. the world might never have known about the supposed deterioration in Indian democracy. After all, polity shows no decline. The the Economist Intelligence Unit shows a slight decline beginning in 2017, but that's when the VDEM report came out, which means the people people compiling the Economist Index would have seen that, well, VDEM is reporting this terrible report on Indian democracy. Maybe we should rethink our analyses. Freedom House only started rating a decline in India in 2019, 2 years after the VDEM data came out. In the absence of VDEM, there likely would be no serious talk of an electoral autocracy emerging in India. Instead, the few non-VDEM related sources, like Reporters Sans Frontières, would be considered wild extremist accusations against a country that is widely considered by academics to be a high-quality democracy. In fact, if we look through the Economist Intelligence Unit, we have very little information about how it's compiled. But Freedom House provides very good documentation on its index and how it's constructed. Freedom House says that its analysts, quote, use a broad range of sources, including news articles, academic analyses, reports from non-governmental organizations, individual professional contacts, and on-the-ground research to evaluate democracies. In other words, at Freedom House, their analysts would have read all the news coming out of VDEM and would have incorporated that into their view of Indian democracy. And just to emphasize how difficult it is to make these judgments, one of the items in the Freedom House Index is a question that its analysts must evaluate for 210 different countries and territories. That is, every item has to be evaluated for 210 countries and territories. And I'm just going to read one of the items. Quote, do laws, policies, or persistent socioeconomic conditions effectively impose rigid barriers to social mobility? Now, you might answer that for India, oh, the caste system, quote unquote, imposes rigid barriers. You may be right, but it's not only India that's being ranked. What about Kiribati, small Pacific Island country that is rated a high-quality democracy on all of these indices? Do laws and policies in Kiribati impose barriers on social mobility? Who knows? What about in Belize? What about in Costa Rica? What about in Botswana? And you get the point I'm trying to make is that in order to answer these kind of questions, the experts at Freedom House or at any other organization have to go to the news. They have to go to Wikipedia. They have to look things up because no person could possibly answer questions like that for 210 different territories. Now, VDEM gets around that. VDEM has literally hundreds of experts who contribute. Most of them either live in the country being evaluated or study the country being evaluated. So VDEM has, that's why we all turn to VDEM, because VDEM really does have on the ground, or if not on the ground, deep expert knowledge, and it tries to establish that for every country it studies. So let's take a look at how VDEM is constructed. VDEM is based on a theory called polyarchy, which was created by the American political scientist Robert Dahl to study democracy. And polyarchy is it's often summarized as a 7-point hierarchy of things you need to have a democracy. I'm just going to read off a few. People have to be able to form associations. Can't have no parties, no democracy. They have to have alternate sources of information that are not monopolized by any one group. So there has to be a variety of news sources. They have to have freedom of expression, including political expression. Again, that seems reasonable. People have to have the right to run for public office. They have to have the right to vote. There have to be frequent elections. And the government has to make the people in charge of the government have to be elected officials. And these all sound like reasonable criteria. And these 7 criteria have formed the basis for the structure of the VDEM Democracy Index. The VDEM Democracy Index actually has 5 major components, but they're all derived from these. And I'll just very quickly rattle them off. So in VDEM, sorry, I'm just skipping ahead in my notes. So in VDEM, the 5 sub-indexes are: 1, are officials elected? 2, is there universal suffrage? 3, are the elections clean? 4, do people have freedom of association? And 5, do people have freedom of expression? And that sounds reasonable at first glance as a way to, I mean, if you have all those things, you have a democracy. I don't want to quibble with liberal democracy, illiberal democracy, Western democracy, non-Western democracy. We all want people to have freedom of expression, freedom of association, clean elections with universal suffrage, where the people in charge are the elected people, not appointed people or kings or queens. Okay, good enough. However, when you operationalize these, you end up with some bizarre anomalies. For example, out of the 179 countries rated by VDEM, 131 get perfect scores for elected officials. That is more than half the world, about 2/3 of the world has elected officials. This includes countries like Belarus, Cuba, Libya, Russia, Syria, even Vietnam, which is a communist dictatorship, has elections. And it's the elected officials who run the country. China gets a 0 on this because in China, the party determines who runs things. In Vietnam, the party determines who is allowed to stand for election. And there's a fake election, so Vietnam gets a perfect score. VDEM documentation actually notes that their elections index, quote, a popular election is minimally defined and also includes sham elections with limited suffrage and no competition. All right, so right off the bat, we have 5 major indicators of democracy. We can ignore elected officials because the countries that have elections range from America and India and Australia right down to Vietnam, Syria, and Russia. They all get perfect scores. The second VDEM indicator is universal suffrage. Now, this is a useful indicator for going back in time. Before the 1920s, most countries did not have voting for women. Are they true democracies if half the population can't vote? Even up until the 1960s, many African Americans were prohibited from voting, or prevented from voting, I should say, in the United States. So we should penalize countries. I mean, South Africa was a great democracy in 1970 if you were white, but of course, if you weren't white, you couldn't vote. So universal suffrage is a reasonable thing to measure. But nearly every country in the world, 174 out of 179, have technically universal suffrage. That includes China, Hong Kong, Iran, North Korea, the Gaza Strip, Venezuela. That is, it's simply not an issue. VDEM documentation, again, notes that this takes into account only, quote, legal de jure restrictions, not restrictions that may be operative in practice. So again, we have 5 indicators of democracy. We've already got rid of 2 of them. Elected officials and universal suffrage simply don't matter because everyone gets it. So they have no result, they have no effect on who's ranked where, because even Vietnam gets a perfect score on these 2 indices. Okay. The third subcomponent of VDEM is clean elections. India already did iffy on that. It was ranked 59th in the world in 2014. It's now down to 91st for clean elections. That was actually last year. I haven't updated this for this year. In other words, the Indian elections are less free and fair than legislative council elections in Hong Kong, and roughly on a par with the single-party elections in Vietnam. How is that? Oh, and are worse, substantially worse than at the height of the emergency in 1976. Now, how can Indian elections be of lower quality today than they were in a year when elections were literally suspended? And VDEM has an answer for that. That is, its survey does not ask, I mean, it does have one question that simply says, how free is the election? But most of the questions are on the order of, is there vote buying? Is there violence at the polls? Is the electoral list complete? Does the Electoral Commission have full authority? Which means if Hong Kong maintains a perfect electoral list, there's no violence in its elections, everything goes very smoothly on election day, you can only vote for an approved candidate. But nonetheless, the election goes smoothly, Hong Kong gets a perfect score for the free elections. All right, so now we have 3 of the 5 that don't matter. I mean, if we really want to understand not the level of democracy, we're using Robert Dahl's theory to study the level of democracy, and these first 3 major components just don't matter for distinguishing between countries. They matter for distinguishing between the 21st century and the 19th century, but they don't matter for distinguishing between countries in the modern era. So now we go to the more subjective indicators of democracy: freedom of association and freedom of expression. India, these are 2022 data. It's worse in 2023. I'm sorry I haven't updated these data. India was ranked 116th in the world in 2022 for freedom of association. That's pretty bad. The VDEM helpfully provides a benchmark for its evaluators. So they're given historical examples. 116th in the world is not as bad as Spain under Francisco Franco in the 1930s, but it's worse than Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe in the 1990s. Now, is freedom of association in India worse today than under Mugabe's Zimbabwe? You be the judge, but I will point out that India was already rated very low, 92nd in the world in 2014. India has always gotten low marks for freedom of association. But the worst one is freedom of expression. India was ranked 130th in the world for freedom of expression. Personal freedom in India is rated worse than in Pakistan and far worse than in Indonesia, which recently enacted Sharia law. In fact, India is considered by VDEM and its expert panel one of the worst countries in the world for personal freedom of expression. Now, I think that's incredible. I don't think that can be taken seriously. I think the experts who evaluate for VDEM are frankly living on another planet. I've been monitoring English language Indian media for 5 years. It seems very clear to me that people can and do criticize the government in India. I watch, again, my guru Rajdeep Sardesai's weekly podcast. He relentlessly criticizes the government and yet is able to publish what he says. I'll be frank, I'll be open about this. I don't have the capacity to monitor the Hindi, Marathi, Malayalam, etc. media. And it is conceivable that in these media I don't monitor, the entire media landscape is highly repressive and nobody can criticize the government. I wouldn't know. I suspect I would hear about it. That is, I suspect that the English language critics, I watch Karan Thapar on The Wire, I suspect The Wire would be reporting about the severe repression of Hindi language media if it were occurring, but I would get it secondhand. But I read The Wire, and The Wire is thoroughly anti-BJP, and yet somehow still seems to be on the internet. So I do question that 130th in the world ranking for freedom of expression. But let's say it's correct. I mean, I'm not saying it is correct, but for the sake of reasoning, let's say that it's correct. The experts are right. Still, India has elections. Everybody can vote in those elections. The people they elect actually run the country. That is, in a well-designed democracy index, India would be doing so much better on elections that it would counterbalance the supposed terrible freedom of expression. and India would end up, upper half of the pack. But the VDEM index, because of its design flaws, does not allow those superior qualities of Indian democracy, which everyone acknowledges is superior, to balance out the negative qualities, which we may debate, because everybody gets top scores on those objective qualities. Nonetheless, the poor methodology of VDEM has been reified into an objective fact through what some social scientists, I didn't coin this term, but I love the term, like to call the charisma of statistics. That is, because the stats out there, we accept that it's true. Now, I don't know how to get around this. I don't know how to produce a correct ranking. Many Indians, and I know there's a new government or a new effort in India, I don't know who's sponsoring it, to create a new democracy ranking. That's largely irrelevant because what matters is not where India is ranked. What matters is, do people read the ranking? I mean, according to Polity database, which anyone can download today, India has the second best democracy in the world, 1 point from being perfect. Yet that's not part of the discourse. The real challenge is not producing a better democracy index. The real challenge is educating people to look seriously at the data we have and to form an independent judgment about the quality of Indian democracy that doesn't simply repeat the headlines from a flashy report produced by the VDEM Institute. All right, thank you everyone for listening, and I'm all yours for questions, comments, and thoughts.
I think I'll kick off with a question, Salvatore. Now, from what you have said about the VDEM parameters and their data collection methods and things like that, and if the reality as we experience in India from an Indian perspective is very different than what the VDEM is producing, then are we not going to the cliche that garbage in, garbage out?
My role is to be an educator. I would like to educate people to understand that virtually all of the traction, virtually all of the statistical power that is downgrading Indian democracy comes from one source, which is VDEM, and mostly from one indicator, which is freedom of expression. If you genuinely feel that India is a repressive police state where, as Reporters Sans Frontières believes, it is one of the 20 worst countries in the world for freedom of the press, then, Indian democracy is compromised. I don't believe that. I don't think others should believe that. But the index is what it is. And as I'm notorious for saying, it's Indian intellectuals who've made it that. Both Reporters Sans Frontières and VDEM base their analyses on reports given primarily by experts in the country, which means that it's either journalists or journalism professors who are telling VDEM and RSF that India has no press freedom.
Avinash, you're on mute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a question which has been dropped, and it's similar to what I was going to ask as well. So, like when you mentioned about the quality and economic intelligence units output, which generally are not seen in media at the moment, why some agencies like Polity have, say, higher ratings for countries, others like VDEM or Freedom House, something different. In fact, a month ago, through Hindus of Australia, they had published about a paper which was written in 2021, which is by Kolsinza and Paul Christian Bruckner. I'll share it shortly. What they had mentioned about these ratings, and these were from the VDEM, WGI, IDEAS, and DG, that the and I quote that the problem extends beyond the particular set of indices and indicators of rule and law, democracy, and corruption in the 4 data sources we described. For any longitudinal analysis with one of these indicators, an analogous analysis with a different indicator will likely yield a different, sometimes opposite result.
Yeah.
It's very problematic when models are used to adjudicate between competing theoretical explanation that predict opposite effects. So how, because it's whole different set of thing, is there something which you are looking as a social scientist so that, something standardized can be put in, which can look at this whole scenario in a non-partisan way? I do understand, like you mentioned, 210 territories with a whole different set of things, which can't be seen in binaries. It's a very difficult task. Thank you.
As with many things we measure that are synthetic measures, I mean, democracy is a concept. I can measure how many journalists were killed in India in a given time frame to study safety of journalists. Press freedom, that's tough. Democracy, of which press freedom is a component, that's even harder. As with all things that are concepts that we attempt to measure, ultimately, only God knows the answer. All we have are different approaches and different people's operationalizations of these concepts. As you say, different operationalizations of democracy produce wildly different results for some countries, in particular for India, but also I think for other countries that are relatively poor but are nonetheless democracies. And in my own view, much of this comes from the fact that India is exceptionally a poor country that's a true democracy. And I think that results in lots of problems. All the various indices rate all the rich countries as democracies, right? Okay, whether the United States is number 8 in the world or number 20 in the world hardly matters in comparison to Saudi Arabia and China. All of them rate Saudi Arabia, China, North Korea as being non-democracies. The question comes in the middle, and in the middle, there are wildly different answers. And we have to reckon with VDEM simply because VDEM is, frankly, the best funded, best theorized, statistically, methodologically most sophisticated index out there. Does it give wrong answers? Sure, I think it does. But it's the best of a bad bunch and must be taken seriously. But I really want to emphasize that if we didn't have VDEM, we wouldn't be having these discussions.
Yeah, thank you for that. The next question is, who funds the major rating agencies? Any chance they may be infiltrated or influenced by international players who have a stake in upstepping or downgrading some particular countries?
Yeah. So for people who aren't involved in these kind of measurement challenges, I can understand the impulse to believe that these problems are driven by funding. I really want to assure you they are not. VDEM was not designed in any way to look askance at Indian data. And I'm sure when they came up with their number, they were as surprised as anybody that in their first evaluation in 2017 that India fared so poorly, because all prior evaluations of Indian democracy had rated it very highly. The fact is that we come to an understanding of the world based on what we see and hear, and that creates a reality of its own. Or as the founder of sociology put it, Emil Durkheim said, social facts are real and real in their consequences. We don't know what quality of Indian democracy is. Nobody paid VDEM to rate India poorly. They paid VDEM to set up a methodology. I think it's a highly flawed methodology, not just flawed for India, but a flawed methodology. Nonetheless, when India popped up very bad on that methodology, well, it simply created the reality that there's an emergency in Indian democracy. And that reality now is percolated through dozens of books, articles. You can read the New York Times, the Washington Post. They're all convinced that Indian democracy has been destroyed by Narendra Modi, by one man. They're all convinced of this. But they all know that ultimately because they read it in VDEM. So when a radical Indian intellectual comes to the New York Times with an op-ed saying India has become, a near fascist state, or India has become, they're primed to be receptive to that because they already know it's true. How do they know it's true? They read it in VDEM, right? So it took a few years, but the truth has crystallized out of this initial, this initial seed, and now it's simply the truth. But it's not because somebody paid for something. It's just the unfortunate workings out of how a group of Swedes set up what they believed was a neutral methodology for studying democracy.
Thank you. Premji, you have a question?
You're on mute, Premji. Please unmute yourself.
I just want to thanking Salvatore for the wonderful talk. I've actually never heard of this index before as a social scientist. Nonetheless, I got a series of questions, if I may. I'll start with the index. How is the Indian government taking the index?
Has what? Sorry.
How's the Indian government taking this index? Are they making any effort to actually improve the rating of India on that index at all?
I don't believe so, and that may be because the index is designed not to be influenceable by government action. So it's not like the Corruption Perceptions Index, which was suspended because China had been influencing its scores in the index. The VDEM is fundamentally, the data themselves fundamentally come from a survey of intellectuals, primarily academics, who work in the country being studied. And they evaluate a series of variables. There's then a process that uses a well-established technique called item response theory that tries to examine, well, if these 20 people gave me these 20 answers on the question, what is the true answer, most likely true answer that would have resulted in these 20 answers I got? So ultimately, the only way to influence it would be, to try to make the Indian political science establishment like the government better, right? There's no direct way to influence the performance. I really want to stress, the evaluation is not being done in Yottinborough. The evaluation is being done on people's desktops, mostly in India.
What was the sample size, if you remember, for the latest?
Depends on the question. So VDEM uses different experts for different questions, and I think there's some 400 questions, but each one is generally answered for India by something like 15 to 25 people.
15 to 25. So it's just expert opinion, right?
It's expert. It's all expert opinion. None of it goes to the public. It's entirely based on expert opinion, or as VDEM would say, expert evaluation.
And how is there a selection process of experts? Is that
yes? They have a website where you can register as an expert with them. They'll check your credentials. They also, though, I think most of their experts have been recruited by them from among people who publish in journals. On that questioning of expertise, look, this is something that I've written about a bit. And part of the problem is that even an expert can't really answer the question being posed. So let me take a simple question we ask an expert. Is the Electoral Commission influenced by politicians? Now, if I'm an expert who studies, I'm an Indian political scientist who studies Indian elections, I may have an opinion about whether the Electoral Commission has been influenced by the government. Can I know that? I'm not in a position to know that. In fact, the only way I know is because I've read in the newspapers allegations that the Electoral Commission is influenced. So even the experts are not themselves, although they are experts, they're not in a position to know the thing on which they are answering the question. It's kind of like asking a nuclear expert, is nuclear power safe? They don't know if it's safe. Now, if you ask them, can this reaction go out of control under this specific circumstance? Yeah, okay, they can do the chemistry and they can tell you that this reaction is, endothermic and thus cannot go out of control. Fine. But the overall evaluation, they can't possibly tell you. And in the same way with VDEM, yeah, I don't know if the Electoral Commission is being influenced by politics. I have to go to the internet to find out. What did the Times of India say? What did the Indian Express say? So I don't really have the expertise that I am being surveyed for.
Thank you, Premji.
You are again on mute, Premji.
Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick one. In terms of democracy, I strongly believe there is a fair bit of depletion in the quality of democracy around the world, just not in India, across the world. And the reality is the democracy, in fact, is founded on the free society. And free society means, the democratic society means less regulation.
You may feel that way, but again, I would emphasize that you are not in a position to know that information.
Nonetheless, the most government around the world is becoming quite regulated, laws coming in, and there is significant amount of infringement of the human rights around the world, just not in India, but across the world.
How much regulation is there in Eswatini, and has that regulation been inappropriate? Who knows, right? Someone in Eswatini knows, but you're not in a position to know. And this is really the problem with many of these. We may have broad brush impressions of things. It's very difficult, and that's why VDEM, to its credit, gets very specific, very detailed questions, and it only allows people who have credentialed expertise on the issue to answer those questions. My main complaint about VDEM is not the experts. I disagree with the experts. I don't believe that India has terrible freedom of expression, but that's a disagreement. I can't say that they're wrong. What I can say is the structure of the VDEM system puts all of the evaluation of democracy on freedom of expression, giving insufficient credit to whether or not you hold elections, with the result that a repressive system that didn't hold elections but had freedom of expression would in fact rate better than a system that held elections but was rated not to have freedom of expression.
Thank you, Premji. So the next one is a combination of two different questions. You mentioned that VDEM is like one of the most robust kind of databases there is in this case, but you also mentioned that it's based on, a lot of its data is based on few experts. So does it create, and this is a restructure of the question that came in, so does it create among the academia, and Australian academia in particular, as we are here, sort of bias to see how India looks from outside? Like, is it does it create an impression that India is a regime and not a democratic government? So how big is the impact in the academia?
So absolutely, the VDEM project has created a reality that has now become accepted by the rest of the world, including in Australia. It's created its own reality because we don't know. I mean, it's just like if you have a corruption, if you have a corruption index of 180 countries, and the corruption index says that this country's clean and that country's dirty, that's what gets reported. And then how do I know which countries are corrupt? I only know because I read it in the newspaper, what the corruption index said. None of us are in a position to actually know. Even those of you who are Indian, who have a lot of familiarity with India, do you know what's going on at a polling booth in a village in a state you've never visited in your life? You have no idea. None of us are in a position to know. what VDEM is supposed to do is aggregate that expert knowledge and narrow questions into a broader index. My argument is that first, the expert views being expressed for India lack face validity. It's inconceivable that India is one of the most repressive countries in the world. It's just inconceivable. And second, even if that is true, the design of VDEM produces an outcome. India is an autocracy that is an inappropriate outcome for because of the design flaws in VDEM. That is the correct interpretation, even if we accept VDEM's data, should be that India is a democracy that restricts freedom of speech.
Thank you. The next one is, and it's sort of in a different way impacts Australia as well. So what is the impact of VDEM rating on India? So for say one election outcome, second gaining UN seat, third IMF standing. If it's inconsequential, then why to bother? And I ask why Australia is connected, because geographically we are a very big country, and a whole lot of it is remote communities. So it's sort of impact, but rather than UN seat and IMF standing, it affects in a different way in Australia. So like the question was like, if its impact, is it consequential or not?
So the first problem is that its greatest consequence is in India, where unfortunately it's become politicized, and with the result that the currently governing party, the BJP, ironically has no vested interest in improving India's VDEM ranking, because there's nothing better for a nationalist government in a highly traditional society like India than to be attacked by a bunch of Europeans. And those attacks by a liberal European intelligentsia are electorally good for the BJP. They're not bad for the BJP. Very few, demographically, the number of Indians who are going to vote against the BJP because the Swedish-based VDEM Institute said that it was repressive, that's a tiny number of people compared to the number of people who can be motivated by the nation is under attack by outside forces. And that's why Dr. Jaishankar does not spend all of his time arguing against the VDEM rankings. He spends all his time saying, who are you to comment on Indian democracy? Okay, so that's the first problem. The second, and I think this is what the questioner really meant about consequences. The second consequence is that subtly, it affects India's international relations. In the US, in Australia, there's pressure against cooperating with India because of India's supposed terrible human rights record. And it's repeatedly brought up when the Republicans are in power in the US or liberals in Australia, it probably doesn't matter that much. With Democrats in the US and Labor in Australia, it does matter. It restricts India's access, for example, to US defense technology sharing or for US intelligence sharing. Why? Because the US doesn't share intelligence with repressive dictatorships, quote unquote, like India. Right? So there's a lot of potential for limiting India's entry into the coalition of democracies that effectively run global governance, because the other democracies have now become convinced that India is not one of them. So, for example, when Narendra Modi visited the White House, and there was a press conference at the insistence of the White House that there must be questions asked at the White House, when Narendra Modi was asked about the human rights problems, which inevitably was the only question he was asked, he just said, it's not your right to ask. When Joe Biden was asked about cooperation with India due to its supposed terrible human rights record, Joe Biden says the U.S. does not interfere with domestic matters. Joe Biden did not say, no, I think these claims are overblown. India really is a country that respects human rights. Right? So the cooperation changes from we're cooperating because we're a community of democracies to we're cooperating reluctantly because India is important, even though it is a repressive regime. And I think that limits cooperation with India. Businesses will still invest there, and things are still, but it ultimately limits cooperation with India because how India is perceived in countries like Australia, the United States, United Kingdom.
Thank you. Another one is with the change in overall global perspective towards India, as of it has been going for some years, does the VDEM rating really matter in a long term? And I'll put a secondary question to it, which slipped earlier, that if we want to have these, read about these ratings about India and Australia, especially from the polity, where can we get one? We can put those links in the video description.
You don't have to. For polity, all you have to do, I'm this close to sneezing.
Yeah.
For polity, all you have to do is search polity database, but then you have to download an Excel file. I mean, it's not easy to access. VDEM, you just download a glossy brochure, or you go to Wikipedia, you can get the VDEM data. So polity data are out there. If you search polity democracy data, you'll instantly find it, but you have to go looking for it. As for the first half, sorry, I hate two-part questions because I never remember the first half.
The first one was, with changing the overall global perspective towards India, do the VDEM
does it
ratings
still
really
matter? Look, absolutely, because the global perspective on India is it's a growing economy and it's a big profit opportunity. It's not. India is a free society that we should embrace because of our community values. I think that matters. And there's one, even when it comes to the economy, there's a difference between, going in and holding your nose because the country is run by a terrible dictator, or going in and being enthusiastic about the country because it respects rule of law and has personal freedom. And, unfortunately, the VDEM has created, not intentionally, I really want to stress to people, VDEM has created a social fact that is now accepted throughout the business and government community, that India has terrible human rights problems, like China, but that, like China 10 years ago, India is growing rapidly, and we have to engage despite India's terrible human rights record. And frankly, I just think that's the wrong narrative and an undesirable narrative for India to have.
Milinji, on to you.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a couple of comments about the impact of this VDEM reports and the multiplier effect of the VDEM effect, VDEM index. Number one, why Jaishankar doesn't care for it is because in terms of FDI flow, if the corporations in the Western countries, including Elon Musk, Bill Gates, they are interested in investing in India, who cares for what VDEM has to write? Number one. Number two, it reminds me of so basically it is the VDEM is basically bad mouthing India, but it may it is, I mean, it is not going, the reports of VDEM may appear in the English media in India, and that media is read by hardly 1% of the people in India. And those who read English media, they also have an access to the regional media. So, and they are living there in India. So they know what the truth is about. So this kind of propaganda,
and these people never vote,
is unlikely to impact, because they are not voters. And the last thing I'll just like to mention is the VDEM reports reminds me of a book by Catherine Mayo, Mother India, which was written in the 1930s. And she wrote a very damning report about India, that India is the most, worst country in terms of morality and everything. And she wrote that book, which became famous, without visiting India. Now, when Gandhi was asked about the Catherine Mayo book, after a lot of, hue and cry in the media, Gandhi said, well, I have read that book, and it is no more than a drain inspector's report. So that was the comment which Gandhi gave on Catherine Mayo's book, Mother India. And probably a similar comment can be offered on the VDM report. Thank you.
So first, if the VDM report didn't matter, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Second, the financial effects are probably most felt in portfolio investment, but Milind, you'd be better placed to know about that than I am. But finally, I want to go back to Dr. Jaishankar and remind you, let me give you another example. When George Soros said something negative about India, it was just one phrase in a interview he gave. Dr. Jaishankar immediately latched onto that, made it a huge issue, talked about it relentlessly. This, old, rich man, who knows nothing about India. Now, why did he latch onto it? It wasn't because he was feeling defensive that maybe George Soros will influence millions of Indian voters to vote against the BJP. No, it was because he sensed an opportunity. If I pick a fight with George Soros, I can go to my voters and say that we're defending India against that evil, Open Society Foundation. We're defending our society against evil Western imperialists. That's why it matters so much. It's not that when Rahul Gandhi talks about VDM, it's irrelevant. It's not going to sway a single voter. But when Narendra Modi mobilizes that he is defending India against Western detractors, he is mobilizing voters. And that's where I see the main effect of it being domestically in India.
Thank you, Professor Babones. That was a pretty deep session, pretty good knowledge coming from you. We probably need to go on it again because it's such a informative session that it needs to be watched again for a greater understanding. Much appreciated you visiting us tonight. Very, very educational. I'll pass on to Professor Mohan Shetty now to give a vote of thanks. You're mute, Professor.
Yeah, thank you, Avinash. Absolutely, I cannot resist in vouching for what you just said. Professor Salvatore Babones is always an inspirational speaker. I became a big personal fan of his, watching him speak about Indian democracy. And again, you don't only, as a researcher, one of the important characteristics that one should have is you make some predictions and you get them validated based on the factual information on the ground. And that's where you say, okay, whether science is telling the truth or not. That common sense is what was missing in many of these reports, which Professor Babones just spoke about, whether it is VDM Institute, or whether it is National Register, it's Economic Intelligence Unit rankings, or it is a number of those democracy rankings. Most recently, what is a big laughing stock was the World Happiness Report 2024, which ranked India 126th. As Professor Sathe said, if you are getting your data from a flawed system, and again, which Professor Babones also kind of repeatedly stressed, so you're going to get everything wrong. For example, what is most hilarious about this particular World Happiness Report was India was securing lower spot than Libya, Iraq, Palestine, Ukraine, and Pakistan. So that explains, what motives and what kind of data that we are working on. And that's where my sympathies goes out to all those people who take some numbers and just do number crunching and then make some predictions based on these completely non-validated kind of remarks and so on, and which will impact very sensible citizens like myself, because I deeply feel that India is much better compared to many other countries that these people compare. So yeah, I cannot thank you enough for your intellectual depth and rigor that you put into your arguments. And every time I look at, especially I was really happy when you counter your good friend and guru Rajdeep Sardesai. You said that you are a journalist, you are not a scientist. So that was wonderful counter that if I had an opportunity, I would like to surely do that. With some of these people who voice as the external faces of India, and then they really skew all the numbers against India. So in fact, that was one of the reasons why I reached out. The Indian intellectuals are the main killers of India, so to say. Now, thank you so much for all your wisdom, the wealth of knowledge, and the depth of rigor, and the academic rigor that you bring into every discussion. We can't thank you enough for your spending time on a weekend, on a Sunday especially. It's your family time, and we must also thank you, your family, for allowing you to spend nearly an hour and a half with us. Yeah, as Avinash said, that it takes a lot of time for us to sort of go through and kind of digest what you spoke about. Yeah, I on behalf of SETU and the entire team, we would like to thank you from the depth of our heart, and then we would be grateful to have this kind of collaboration going forward. As our forum becomes bigger and bigger, we would come back to you to maybe next time we would have you personally down in Melbourne, and then speak to a larger crowd compared to just talking to a few on online platform like this. Thank you so much, Professor Babones.
We can have the professor after 4th of June. He will have plenty of material to research by that time.
Absolutely, Avinash. Thank you so much. Now back to you, Avinash.
Look, and thanks to all of you. And let me just quickly say, we have created a not-for-profit think tank here in Australia called the Indian Century Roundtable that we're still trying to get corporate members for, but for which we've done some substantial fundraising among individuals. And we're putting out reports and hoping to change, or at least to educate Australians and Westerners more broadly about the real facts about India.
Thank you.
You're all very
Professor.
welcome to do that with us.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you.
excellent. I may add to what you just mentioned. We would really like to know more about how actually you get together, try and pass on this information. What's the way you actually try and get the data, how that is created, what discussions. We are definitely interested in such kind of forums, because end of the day, when we talk about Setu, we actually are trying to make the things more realistic and clearer on both sides of the table. Understand that Western people do have a tendency to look at these indices, but when we actually come up with the true and real figures, then that might help them to have a different perspective. Because if the numbers talk about everything, then let us put the right numbers. And if that can be done collaboratively, absolutely, why not?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Babones, for reminding me, because we follow each other on Twitter. So it's a good reminder for me to follow up on your platform's participation. We'll put that on the video description when we publish this. So thank you. Thank you all for participating in this insightful conversation. And we will come back with more people, and maybe more like great people like Professor Babones here, and we would have him sometime in the future, so that we will get more from him. I'm sure that we only have got very minuscule amount of what he has to offer. So thank you all, and have a good night, and we'll see you soon in the future.
Namaste.
Namaskar, everyone.
Namaste. Thank you very much.
Namaste. Thank
Namaste.
you. Thank you, Dr.
Namaste.
Babones.
Thank you, Professor Babones.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Abhijit ji,
Hmm.
recording stop.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I was about to do that, but I'm just trying.